With the uncertainty in the world today, organizations need business resilience if they are to react, respond, and survive and thrive through so many difficulties. But while 97% of business executives believe business resilience is important, only 47% believe their organization is resilient, according to a new poll by the SAS Institute. According to the Resilience Institute, in their most recent study, there's also an alarmingly low resilience ratio, particularly among individuals under 30. Young females were found to be struggling more than their male counterparts. In another study, 71% of companies do not feel their leaders are effective at developing future leaders. So, given all these challenges, I'm hoping our guests can help better gear ourselves for the challenges we face. Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutwith.com. I'm Vinay Koshy and our guest today is Jason Shen. Jason, you're a resilience expert and executive coach renowned for guiding entrepreneurs through crucial transitions. In fact, your experience as a three-time founder and product leader has really helped you in this. You, I would say, intimately understand the challenges that creative and tech leaders face around fear, burnout, identity, and a sense of purpose. And you are the founder and executive coach at Refactor Labs. And you've got a book coming out, if I believe, if I'm not mistaken, called The Path to Pivot. I'm sure we'll hear a little more about that a bit later. But Jason, I'm curious. Obviously, your personal experiences have led you to this idea of helping people through resilience. But was there one in particular that stood out to you and has been the genesis moment of this journey?
Yeah. Vinay, thanks for having me on. And I'll tell you, 2 years into my first business venture, we were toast. And it was frankly pretty embarrassing because we'd gone through this Y Combinator startup accelerator program. We had raised $1.3 million from some well-known Silicon Valley investors. I was a Stanford grad. We had Stanford and Berkeley students, all the recipes for success. And we had this great idea to revolutionize ride sharing, which, at the time we were thinking long distance and Airbnb was really blowing up. And we had this whole story of a narrative of a disruptive opportunity. And we hit a sort of stalling point in our growth because rides, long distance rides in particular, is inventory that is constantly turning over.
Mm.
So you constantly had to feed the beast. And it just felt like there's this overwhelming, like, how do we grow? We can barely stay afloat. And then we lost one of our biggest sources of growth and distribution, Craigslist. At the same time, we'd released this iPhone app that we thought was really going to catapult our growth. And while there was a little bit of a spike, it fell back. So all of a sudden, we were looking at all of this investment in this app that wasn't going anywhere, all of this growth all these new users that were stopping, no longer coming to our site. And we said, oh, shoot, like we're in serious trouble. And we tried to pivot. We tried to get the team together, come up with some new ideas. A lot of our team was not prepared for this. They thought they were signing up for something that was more of a sure thing. So they weren't comfortable with this. We said, we've got too many people on board to handle trying to make this transition. We let everybody go besides the founders, got rid of our office, went back to our apartment where we were all living, and then spent months and months throwing one idea after on the wall after another, one after another, nothing sticking, nothing agreeing upon. We didn't have that sense of urgency anymore. We still had some money and we were just really slowly spending it. We were a zombie startup,
Mm.
as you might say, not alive, not dead. And ultimately, after 6 months of that, I cracked and I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going out and talking to anybody because I'm embarrassed because we haven't announced what we're doing. We said we weren't doing what we were really doing, but then we didn't have a new thing. And I ended up taking a fellowship opportunity that presented itself in DC and skedaddled out of the company. And my two co-founders were left saying, what are we going to do now? We ended up returning money back to investors,
Mm.
which, okay, better than just like blowing it on a bunch of not important things. But some of the investors said, hey, we didn't invest in you to give us 50 cents on the dollar. That's not what we're here for. We're here for you to go hard and try to swing big at a big opportunity. If you strike out, okay, but at least you went for it. We didn't even finish going for it. We whimpered out. And that was an embarrassing moment. So I think that really planted the seed for this question of how do you adapt? How do you stay resilient in the
Mm.
face of challenges and difficulties without just walking off? And it took me many years to try again and to learn some of those lessons. But that is that moment in my mid to late 20s where I really faced that.
Thank you for sharing that. But given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
I think for me, it's really being comfortable going into new areas and not feeling like I need to rely on stuff that I was good at in the past. So every time I changed roles, changed careers. I've done B2B, I've done consumer, I've done marketplaces, I've done marketing, I've done product. Now I'm coaching, right? I've always been able to be comfortable in that space of not knowing, of being not the expert, but leaning into that and eventually becoming an expert. Resilience was something I started writing about maybe 3 years ago. Now I really feel that I've developed a lot of knowledge, case studies,
Mhm.
expertise in this area. So for me, that's really that willingness to go into the unknown.
Right. And in that area of personal strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
I think that most business leaders are thinking short term, which you've probably talked about this on other episodes. The ability to see in the long run, if you don't innovate, if you don't make mistakes, if you don't try things and fall on your
Mhm.
face occasionally, you are not setting your organization up for long term success. And we all think of Kia used to be that big story of a turnaround, right? This European company that kind of didn't, phones was just one emerging area of their business. And then they shed the other business areas and really went in on phones. And they were the big behemoth in the field. But then they really slowed down their innovation. They got caught up in being their sort of big dog status, and they weren't able to catch the next wave. And I think the companies that you see today, I was at Meta or previously Facebook, and more of all these sort of big top companies, one of the few ones that's left that's still founder led is Mark Zuckerberg and Meta. And one thing that he has is a willingness to make big bets, be wrong, look dumb. People have made fun of the metaverse for a long time, his bad selfies, but he didn't go home. He didn't take his toys and go home. He's still leaning into it. He's playing MMA. This doesn't need to be a Mark Zuckerberg fan.
Yeah.
I don't know him personally, but I respect what he has been willing to do to risk the company's success to continue to bet on the future. And I think a lot of companies are too afraid to do that.
Brilliant takeaway there. Thank you again for sharing that. We talked about your genesis moment in your journey with resilience, uh, but perhaps more fast forwarding a bit. Could you tell us about a time in your entrepreneurial journey when you did face a major setback, but persisted until you found a breakthrough? And what did you learn from that experience?
That's right. So in my second company, 5 years, fast forward 5 years after that sort of startup failed. I was working at Etsy. I was work cultivating one of the engineers at Etsy, and I was like, "Hey, let's start a company together." And we were talking about that. Then Etsy had a whole change in leadership. Their CEO got let go, and there was a change up, and then a layoff happened, and then the new CEO did a second round of layoffs, and I got hit in that second round of layoffs.
Mm.
So on one hand, I knew I was headed out the door to start this company. On the other hand, I didn't like that the way it happened was me getting pushed out. And so I had to scramble to make money while we put together a plan to finance the business. And so we got off on a stumble. We started this business around hiring and evaluating talent, and particularly technical talent, in a way that was more nuanced and less biased based on, the typical interview where you're really grilling somebody and not everyone's going to succeed in that environment, and that's
Mm.
not a reflective of reality. So we spent time building software in that space, building services in that space, building even an agency style model where we were getting money on placement fees. We tried it all. And while we were making some money, we didn't feel like this was a venture trajectory business. And what the one thing I was determined not to do was to whimper out and have this half-assed business, as it were. And so me and my co-founder looked at each other and we had the same feeling. And we had an employee in the business who went out for a conference for a week. And it was during that week of the conference, we said, we got to change something about our business. And we spent the whole week really just hammering out different ideas, different possibilities, thinking about where our assets, our strengths as a business, as founders lay, and ultimately decided to pivot into a very different area, into esports and gaming
Wow.
and building assistive tools for gamers. And so we came back and our employee came back from their conference and we were like, hey, by the way, the business completely changed. And as you see, some of the things that were there was this recognition that it's better to do something than to do nothing. We had this deadline of a time frame that we had to make that transition. And ultimately, we raised new money on that. We gained new investors. We built a sort of a new team. We were backed by Amazon investment vehicle through the Alexa program, worked with some pro esports teams, built a proto AI for gamers that use voice. This is pre
Mm.
ChatGPT, pre Whisper. A lot of these things we really had to pull together ourselves. We couldn't just rely on an API to do it for us. And then COVID hit. And you can dodge death once, maybe dodge death twice, but at some point we had to call it in, and we ultimately took a sort of small acquisition offer through Meta and went in-house. I still consider that a win because my previous business had just plummeted after that attempt to pivot. And this time we successfully made the pivot. We built up the new business and made progress before ultimately taking the exit when we had to. That's an example of where I really started to see the seeds of what the book Path to Pivot kind of entails, because it's we were able to make it work
Mhm.
ourselves.
And out of curiosity, why the shift to esports? That's quite a pivot compared to
It
what you
is,
were doing previously.
yeah. What we were doing previously, what we really looked at was we did iterate on a number of ideas in the hiring space. We wondered, could we work more for candidates? Could we do more traditional applicant tracking software? And we explored some projects in that space, but then we gave ourselves some free reign to play out some bigger, very different ideas. The esports thing came out of this recognition that it was a growing category. We were both grew up as avid video game players. My co-founder had worked at Bloomberg Sports and had done a lot of the
Mhm.
sports analytics tools for like baseball teams. And there was a lot of, they paid good money to get all these analytics to advise their team. And I had been a collegiate athlete in gymnastics. And I saw that esports was like this growing new collegiate scene that was emerging. And I thought maybe we could break into that. That seemed like there was a trend happening and that we could enter and be an early player and grow with these players who would then go off and play in professional tournaments. And so there was a sense that we could identify a shift in the market and be the first to capture it.
Okay. A lot of your earlier experiences fed into that pivot. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
quite a.
But on face of it, it was pretty extreme.
I'm sure there are people listening in at the moment going, resilience is a nice topic. We probably discussed this around the dinner table, etc. But here's the challenge. We are very focused on the numbers as what kind of drives us. So everybody drives us according to the numbers. Is there a correlation between resilience and the bottom line? If so, could you enlighten us?
I think you know the answer, Renee, but for our audience, of course, right? Of course, there is a connection between our results and our resilience. Look, it's easy to stick to the straight and narrow and just follow the plan and keep executing the plan when we live in a calm, stable, steady environment that doesn't change very often, that's slow to evolve. You think the between 1000 AD and 1200 AD, not that much changed about the world. Sure, there were different wars and there were different countries, but it was slow. And now you see companies barely lasting a few decades in the S&P 500 before coming in and out and churning, and that pace of innovation, that pace of volatility, we know it's not slowing down, right?
Mhm.
We know that's not going to magically flatten out. And so the need to be agile, the need to be able to see that something has changed in the environment or even something has changed in the organization that calls for a new approach or an adjustment on the existing approach is more important than ever. And I think a lot of companies, what they do, they try to like double down and be more precise and get the target to a tighter range. And
Mhm.
that's how they control the situation. But what that ends up doing is spending a lot of time on a world that no longer exists. Plans reflect how to approach a world that no longer exists. And so if you are constantly doing that, you're just constantly going to miss on what the world actually is
Mm.
and not get the results you want.
Certainly. You wouldn't be aware of any studies that have looked at the direct correlation between um, a company's ability to survive tough times and the bottom line.
So one study that I think is pretty interesting comes from Fred Wilson of Union Square Ventures. So he's one of the major VCs in New York, backed Etsy, Twitter, Zynga, MongoDB. And he at one point wrote on his blog about looking at a series of their investments over a number of years. And they had like big winners, moderate winners,
Mhm.
and failures. And what he found was that overall, two-thirds of companies went through either a complete or major transformation of their business over the roughly a
Right.
10-year period of the business being in existence. But what's interesting is when you break out the big successes, the moderate successes, the failures of the 5 failures that they had, only 1 transformed, 4 didn't.
Mm.
So in fact, success stories were more stories of transformation. And in fact, the big 5x return plus returns, 7 of them transformed, only 4 did not. So actually almost 2 times actually did transform or versus not, whereas the failures, most of them didn't.
Mm.
So in many ways, you might say that those who choose not to or are unable to significantly transform their business were the ones who fail.
Mm. Brilliant.
And obviously, listeners of this podcast, not all of them are entrepreneurs, not all of them are startup founders. But what I would say is that startups are like a condensed, pressurized version of a otherwise business. You're
Mm.
injecting capital, you're putting greater urgency, greater intensity into it. So it's living the life of a larger business or a moderately operated business or a small business or what have you in a tighter time frame.
Mm.
So we know that all businesses transform. IBM is not the company it was. Nintendo started out making playing cards, right? But it evolved over many years. And so startups just transform under a tighter time frame. But every business, if it wants to be in business in 20 years, GE is nothing like it was in the 90s, right? All businesses have to transform. It's just a matter of how effectively do it and how much support you can have while doing it versus a sort of chaotic effort, or you just cease to exist.
Mm. Brilliant points. Thank you for doing that. I was also wondering if you could share perhaps a personal anecdote or a story from your coaching experiences that uh, illustrates the kind of mind shift required for entrepreneurs to embrace change.
Look, entrepreneurs in general tend to be pretty good about embracing change
Mhm.
because they went out to start their own venture. But I was coaching a senior member of a startup team, and he was not the original founder, but came on and then became part of the founding team and
Mm.
was thus seen as a leader. But even then, there's a difference between that person who's I'm going to be the one to create the business and the person who says, "Hey, I'm here from the start. I'm really excited about this and I want to do it." And for him, this company is in the middle of a pivot right now. So we don't have the end of the story, in fact.
Right.
But what there was this realization, this sort of, oh, shoot moment when it was like, hey, we've been working on this one approach, an AI business that we're selling to this particular kind of customer for a particular type of problem. We thought we were doing okay. And then the investors came back and said, this is not acceptable. The results we're seeing from you are really poor. We think you should massively change the business or maybe even lay off people if you don't make some rapid changes. And he realized that even his job was potentially on the line,
Mm.
right? Yeah, he's one of the sort of senior members of the team, but he's not the CEO. And he knew that, and the CEO communicated, look, there's a possibility that not very few of us, maybe it's me and one other person, are going to be left in this business. And I think that was a shift for him that made him take it even more seriously, of course, to be like, we got to demonstrate that we're willing to evolve. They had pressure, but also in some ways, a good nudge to wake up and have a wake up call.
Mhm.
And so we really talked about how do you want to handle this time period? Like this company may or may not be here, certainly in a year. You may or may not be here in a year. How would you like to approach this time? And rather than fret about what will I do if I don't work here, recognizing that he has enough sort of runway to be okay for a number of months and land a new opportunity. and to say, let's make the most out of the time that we have, however much time that is. Maybe that's a month, maybe that's 6 months, maybe that's 6 years. But for now, you think about how you want to lead in this period of uncertainty, and the results, I don't want to say will take care of themselves, but the results you cannot control. You can only control
Mhm.
your approach and what you spend your time on.
But you raise an interesting point there because listening to what you're saying, I would imagine there's two distinct competing forces inside of people's heads. One being the emotional pressures, depending on their personal circumstances. And then, of course, there's the more intellectual side of things about what could be done. And perhaps the biggest challenge for most people is to separate the two and put the emotions aside in order to focus on the intellectual in order to create a clear path towards a pivotal progress. Would you concur, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, Vinay, I would actually say it a little differently than
Sure.
that. I would say that it's important to merge and blend and take those two parts, the intellectual and the emotional, together. So, what I mean by that is that emotions are information.
Mhm.
When we look at potentially hiring someone and we think that somebody looks great on paper and all the things check the box, but there's something in our stomach that makes us say, you know what, I'm not sure if this is quite right, there's reason to listen to that.
Mm.
Maybe you still make that hire, but you are very watchful in those first 90 days. Laura Huang, former professor at Harvard Business School, now at Northeastern, has written a lot about gut feel and
Yeah.
gut feel in investments. And she actually argues that early stage investors, when there's not a lot of data, gut feel is a valid and appropriate way to help evaluate a company. It's not that you don't do due diligence, but there's no formula that's going to generate the correct answer about whether to invest or not to invest or how much. Your gut, you do need to include your gut in decisions. Now, you need to make sure your gut is well calibrated. One of the things that maybe is more to what you were saying is that when your emotions are too high or too low, and given what time of day it is or how you were feeling from the
Mhm.
previous meeting, if you're too high because something good happened and you make some irrationally exuberant decisions, or if it's too low because something bad happened, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And in that case, I actually recommend getting more in touch with our bodies. So, look, I'm a nerd. You see the books in my back shelf. I had a computer with the 14 4K modems as soon as those were available. But I'm also an athlete. I trained in gymnastics for 16 years, and I understand and appreciate how important being in tune with my body is for high level performance in gymnastics competition. You had to get good sleep. You had to eat well. You had to, before big meeting, your big event, you would listen to music, stay calm and not over activate your brain on sort of other stimuli. And I think a lot of people who work in computers, who work with business, who value their intellect, almost see themselves as brains, eyes, and hands, right? And it's all an interface into a screen somehow. And they forget that they have a physical body, and that physical body really affects their emotional state and their ability to make good decisions. If someone is struggling, whether a leader or an individual, it's so trite, but it's still under emphasized,
Mhm.
so I'm gonna say it again, is how much sleep are you getting? Are you eating junk food or are you eating whole foods and good meals, right? Are you getting sunlight? These things are going to stabilize our emotional systems because they're gonna stabilize our physical body, and that's going to help with dealing with those difficult and of course, exercising, right?
Mhm.
So all of those things are gonna help deal with and stabilize our emotional system so we can make those good intellectual decisions.
Great points there. Uh, in your book, A Path to Pivot, do you outline a framework for pivoting? And if so, could you
That's yeah.
break down the crucial steps within this framework?
Yeah. So the framework is pretty straightforward. It's 3 steps: align,
Mhm.
explore, commit. And so what the book says is a lot of times there's a lot of lore and myth about pivots. And it's we just came up with a new idea. Even when you asked me, like, well, you went from hiring to gaming. What the heck was that about? And often there's no sort of the interview really skips over that part when you read about it online later. And the truth is, there's a more nuanced approach to pivoting that we took and that I recommend to my coaching clients and to people that I've seen. And it starts with aligning that the business is not where it needs to be, and that spending time exploring new options is worthwhile. Without that alignment with the leadership team, with investors, and then with the rest of the company, it's very hard to implement this next step, because the next step is to say, we are going to put the business on sort of maintenance mode, keep the lights on, right? Don't do anything dramatic. Keep existing customers, service them, fix bugs, but don't try to build anything
Mhm.
super big or new. Don't try to launch some new campaign. Keep it running. Meanwhile, you spend 50, 60, 70% of your bandwidth on new areas. And those new areas need to build on existing assets or insights or trends that you've developed. So assets are, you have a product that works really well. You have a market, an audience of people who are interested in this problem, right? You have so those are like assets. Insights are things that you've learned because you've been working in this
Mhm.
area for a while, and you've seen that, oh, you think that you need a market in this way, but actually you need a market in a different way. These insights then can be points for doubling down. And then the third thing is those market trends, right? If you're the first one to observe, hey, you know what? People are really buying these like finger toe socks, but they're trying to cobble it together by buying from China and whatever. Like me, we could be the first one to do it.
Mhm.
And so that's what we were trying for with the esports and the gaming, that these tools were just coming online. So being the first to make that shift into the new trends, spending that blocked out time, whether it's 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, some amount of time, and then rigorously evaluating, this is still in the explore period, rigorously
Mhm.
evaluating the results and saying, hey, we tried these 5 experiments, we did these surveys, we talked to these people. How do we feel about it? Here's how the existing business has performed. Sometimes when you leave a business alone, it does better, because sometimes we were smothering the business with
Mhm.
too much of the wrong stuff, and it actually thrives once you stop messing with it. And so maybe the result is to go back to the original business with some new understanding and a new appreciation for it. Or it could wither away and say, you know what, it was borderline and now it's very obviously not there. So it feels a little bit easier to then make that shift. And everyone's been a part of the process, they've been enrolled. And that gets to the commit. What is the final decision? Are we going to go all in and really put this business down, or return to the business with that sort of new understanding? So that final commit area and all the things that come with it. Do you change your business name? Do you sell the assets to somebody else? Is that too much work? Those are all things to consider after you made that shift.
I believe in learning from real experiences. So I was wondering, can you provide another case study, if you will, where a business faced this
Yeah.
need to pivot, the challenges they encountered, and the strategies they used to use your framework?
Yeah. One interesting example is Loom. We all know Loom.
Mhm.
Loom's a pretty successful company that does screen recording and sending messages. And it's like this new form of asynchronous communication. They started out as a company called OpenTest. And OpenTest was supposed to be user research, but like user product feedback from experts. So they had this sort of panel of experts and they said, hey, you're working on a new product. Don't just use your testing with random people, send it over to the experts. And so then the experts would send back this video with like their assessments, and people were using it, but it wasn't really taking off, and they were getting frustrated with this, and they weren't sure what was happening. And they ended up taking a period where they looked at this asset. They said, we have this thing. This thing is useful, right? This screen recording. And they were observing that people were using it in different ways. Sometimes people were using it to send messages to their coworkers rather than using it for this feedback mechanism. They're saying, that's odd. That's interesting. What's going on there? And they realized this insight that sometimes it's doing a video call takes too much time, and coordinating the calendar and the schedule. Sending an email isn't quite sufficient. This sort of hybrid model of the screen, which we're all now familiar with, but this is like 2014, 2015.
Mhm.
And so in 2016, they tried a couple other products, but then they ultimately launched something called Open Video, put it on Product Hunt, and they got a ton of traction. And that's when they got that pull from the market that told them like, this is the thing. And I think that's one of the things that goes back to entrepreneurs or business leaders in general. There's this fear that, is this the best we've got?
Mhm.
Maybe this is the best we've got. And there's nothing better out there. And if we spend time doing that, we're just going to go nowhere. And certainly for entrepreneurship, it's true that trying new things doesn't always work out. But when the upside does hit, it hits incredibly. And we live in this world of long tail big hits, right? Where it's like outliers, rare occurrences, but when you do get it, and it's almost worth it to go after that because the biggest movies outsell the second biggest movies by a large margin and so on and so forth. And so having that change in mindset is an important part of how you are willing to go and find that thing that's working.
Yeah. I'm also curious, given the dynamic market environment, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the challenges and opportunities entrepreneurs face when considering a pivot and what are factors they should consider in today's landscape.
So obviously, the thing that everybody's thinking about right now is AI,
Yeah.
right? And it's very hard not to. In every business, every investor phone call, the question comes up, how are you leveraging AI? And this is, I feel, one of those internet mobile phone moments, right? Like, I really feel like there aren't that many of those. And part of the reason why I think you didn't see a lot of big companies emerge after the sort of social media smartphone adoption curve launch is because it's just hard to do something that was a pretty transformative new technology that became available to
Mm.
so many well, thanks to Google and Apple's like widespread proliferation of those phones. It just enabled things that weren't otherwise possible. Now we're all iterating on various versions of that. And there were attempts with crypto and there were attempts with some of the metaverse VR stuff that's still not quite there, but still out there. AI is that new thing. And the question becomes, we don't want, especially if you're a business that's already out there. It's been a year. It's been not quite a year. Can you imagine like us having this conversation a year ago before ChatGPT
Mm.
emerged? Everyone just say, you're going to go on about AI again. Like we all know, yeah, it's coming soon. It's almost going to be here. And then bang, overnight, education needs to change. Journalism needs to change. How we evaluate legal documents is going to change. All of these things are going to change. And I don't have a specific playbook except to say that it's very hard to imagine business as usual making sense in this environment. And there is plenty of evidence for that. And I don't think most businesses can go wrong by taking this too seriously,
Mhm.
right? I think it's much more likely, it's just more natural to think, well, this is just one of many things I need to be aware of. And to say, actually, this is something that we need to take incredibly seriously. And that doesn't mean throw out your old business overnight, but it means being intentional about exploring AI, testing it in a wide variety of products and situations and operational areas in your business and seeing and adopting what works.
So, if I could put that maybe a little bit differently, are you suggesting that we develop a series of experiments to try certain possibilities of where we could find traction and then test out these hypotheses?
Yeah. So the simple way to say it is look, in the short run, you could do nothing with AI, just keep cranking on your
Mhm.
existing plan and not waste any time and energy on this AI stuff. And maybe in the very short term, 3 to 6 months, you'll see some results that maybe surpass your competitors there's because experiments take time,
Mhm.
right? And it takes attention and some of it doesn't work. So you're screwing around, it can seem like, and this didn't pan out. And what was the point of doing that? But I think this moment is a moment where doing that is the short-term loss of a moderate loss in your kind of business productivity because you're spending time on these experiments for a long-term meaningful gain in, wow, if we can really drop the cost of this particular part of our operations by 90% because we can manage an AI workflow that changes that for us, that's going to be a long-term advantage.
Mm.
And in a sort of volatile moment like this, I think you have to say we're willing to cut some of our targets. Right? You talked about the numbers, cutting some of the targets to say spend more time experimenting. We're going to give you a little bit of a slack here because we expect next year the numbers should be
Mhm.
way bigger
Right.
because of results that you've seen.
Now, executive coaching obviously plays a pivotal role in guiding leaders, especially through change. Is there an example that you could share where your coaching has made a significant difference in entrepreneurs' ability to navigate a critical pivot?
So look, one one interesting story is an entrepreneur that I worked with who was actually from Brazil, and
Mhm.
he had a business in Brazil that had done quite well, called Rock Content, and it was, at this point, like 200-person company, and they acquired several American
Yeah.
companies, and they were doing quite well. And he was just feeling tired of it, bored of it. It felt like a business and not like a technology innovation thing anymore. And he sold his shares and semi-retired and spent some time in Europe and realized I'm too young to really retire just quite yet. But when he sat down to go back on his computer, he couldn't really get much done because he was out of the habit.
Mm.
And that's when he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I need to get back on my game here." And so we actually worked a lot together to build up his sort of habit of coding, which was what he really wanted. He wanted to see the
Wow.
number of hours he was coding go up. That was the result. But we also spent time encouraging him to focus on the emotional aspects. He felt kind of lonely being in Brazil and not being with a lot of other innovators that he felt were
Mhm.
on his level. And he was supposed to go out for an AI conference in San Francisco, and we talked about having him extend his stay. So he ended up spending several months in San Francisco rather than just a few
Mhm.
days. And in that time, he built up new relationships, new networks, got out to dinners, talked to a lot of people, and he started to get very excited about new possibilities, new opportunities, and a sense of confidence because he was like, nobody is saying anything that I haven't seen on Twitter, online.
Mm.
Nobody has some secret better way to approach this stuff. We're all to the point previously, like in these moments of transition, nobody has a total clear picture of what's going to happen. You're almost on a more playing field than people who are like ahead of you
Mm.
before because now their advantages are like more negated. So he felt a lot of confidence and went back home and started to really get more serious about his engineering, started to hire some people. And so by the time we parted ways, he had hired several people. He had a team going. He was iterating on multiple products. So he really went from no business, no momentum to I've got a bunch of things cooking and I'm on a roll now. Thanks, Jason. Really appreciated this. So that was in the course of 6 to 9 months. Like it's a short amount of time, but it's also a pretty extended amount of
Mhm.
time given this was his full focus.
Mm. I'm thinking about predictable revenue growth, and balancing growth and profitability is obviously a crucial aspect to that. Can you provide insights into how we can develop strategies that prioritize both?
Look, I'll be honest, Vinay. For me, it's always about the top line.
Mhm.
I always figure you can figure out the costs later. I would say that R&D always looks expensive at first, and part of the process is going from R&D to operationalizing it. In a lot of ways, startups are outsourced R&D, right? If you don't want to spend the time to screw around with things, let a bunch of other startups do it, and then you buy the one that works. And so, to me, the big question is, do you believe you have the talent in-house to do the experiments yourself? Because that's probably cheaper than having to buy the winner of the sort of AI game or whatever new technology, new trend that's happening and buy the best company out of that batch, or to buy the second or third place one and then have to figure out how to fix it up and make it work for your business. So
Mhm.
that's really the question, right? If you're going to stick around, you're going to need to innovate. Are you going to innovate in-house and theoretically cheaper, but more of your time and mental effort to run it successfully? Or would you rather just buy something later, but definitely you're going to have to pay more for it?
Mhm. And the leadership obviously sets the tone, so to speak, for change within an organization. Is there perhaps something, and maybe you could share an example where a team has effectively led the company through a significant pivot?
I'll give it to you in another angle,
Mhm.
which is that I'm working with a senior leader right now who has inherited a team that he is challenging to be more rigorous about their approach to finance, their approach to strategy. And it's both working, but it's also sending some ripples through the organization where people are getting a little uncomfortable and getting a little scared. Wow, this guy's making us redo a bunch of things that we've done before. What's going on? I'm uncomfortable here. And he's fully comfortable. He thinks these are the right things to do. It seems, correct to me. I'm not there to really evaluate that, but I'm here to guide his mindset and his
Mhm.
influence. And what I'm working with him on is helping them understand the reasons why he's making some of these significant changes and helping them understand how this stays true to their values and isn't a deviation from the values, right? So the other side of all this change, and we've talked about this, is that it's uncomfortable,
Mm.
it's scary. And even if I can psych up a leader or if a leader's already psyched up to go make that change, they still got to bring everyone else on board, which is why that align, explore, commit approach is so important. It really helps people get an understanding of this is a serious deal. We got to tackle it and we're going to spend some time on it. And here's how we got to this end result. My job now working with this client is to help him tell that story. I almost talk about it like a campaign slogan. To go back to Meta for a second, Facebook had done previously move fast, break things, which of course led to both great things for the company and problems for the company and problems for society. But he had this new mantra of the year of efficiency, which encapsulated in a simple term what we were trying to do with the business, which is become more profitable, spend less on things that are wasteful, whether that's financially or time and operationally.
Mhm.
So when a leader is at this high level, it's hard to make detailed, complex change happen. Sometimes you really got to work it down to a single slogan that you can repeat over and over again that helps people get comfortable with and enact the change.
Brilliant. Obviously, communication is key to the whole piece, and you mentioned telling stories. But is there anything else that you feel is often missing in the way we communicate change?
I think one of the things that I talk a lot about, we talked at the top about resilience. And I really, when I talk about resilience, I talk about it as a series of skills
Mhm.
rather than some innate quality or trait. And I think that the way we approach the topic really matters. So saying, hey, this is a skill. This is a skill you can learn. You didn't know how to ride a bike until you learn how to do it
Mhm.
and then you can do it, right? Or it might even be more like playing baseball or cricket or football or what have you. Like it's a multi-factor set of skills. So resilience is actually four skills in my framework. It's responding in the immediate aftermath of change and responding in the moment, firefighting in a way.
Mhm.
It's restoring, so healing and grieving and connecting with others after the sort of damage has been done. It's rebuilding, which is running those experiments, setting a new direction, and really like building momentum. And then it's reflecting, which is learning, processing the change, and then telling that story of the change for yourself and for others, right? So most people are good at least one of those four,
Yeah.
right? So rather than saying you guys aren't resilient, it's maybe you're resilient at least in one area. You have that skill of resilience. Maybe you're really good at firefighting, but if all you do is firefight, you're going to get burnt up. Or you spend a lot of time, you connect people together in your store and you feel better, but you don't then take that next step and actually make the change. Or you constantly are making that new change, but you never think about what you learned from the process. So then your new action isn't much better than the
Mm.
first action. So it's spinning in place. So it's really when all of those skills work together that you see the kind of adapting and the overcoming of change most effectively.
Brilliant. I'm thinking of the broader picture here, and I'm curious how you've seen entrepreneurship evolve over the years, and perhaps more bring this more to the point of today. What advice would you have for entrepreneurs to stay agile and thrive despite this changing and fast evolving landscape?
Yeah. So I entered into this field of entrepreneurship in the sort of the recovery of the dot-com boom
Mm.
bust, right? The 2001 sort of bust. And then by the time I was graduating from college, that was more of a distant memory and the recovery was underway. And then Facebook was proliferating on all these campuses and all these sort of Google was really rising as a company. So there was a lot of optimism at the time of companies can change the world. There was this continued growth period where the social network comes out, it gets very cool. At the time, startups was still not that
Hmm.
cool, but it started to become cooler and cooler. And with the interest rates continuously low for a long time, there was, even as I admitted, less of an emphasis on profitability, sometimes not even revenue. It was
Mm.
just like user growth, right? Then it was user growth. And then it was like, oh, but you also need to make money. And now, today, with interest rates where they are, it's about profitability. So now it's not just can you grow and make money, but can you grow and make money and not lose a lot of money in the process. And you see this in some of the companies that are IPOing, like a lot of times they're barely profitable or they're cash flow positive, but not formally
Hmm.
profitable, or they're losing less money every year. It's like, great. At some point, you'll actually turn a profit. This is what we're supposed to be doing here, building a business. And I think that really reflects the current time frame is how can you do more with less? Don't build a big team. Use AI yourself. Build AI, but use AI inside your company. Use other techniques and really be efficient and not just fast.
Mm.
So those are some of the differences that are coming out of today's landscape. And we're going to see a lot of businesses sell for low amounts of money or shut down altogether because they can't quite make that shift fast
Pivot.
enough.
Yep. Well, this has been terrific. Is there perhaps an aspect or two around this idea of resilience that you find doesn't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
I would go back to this idea of storytelling because I think that often people, certainly leaders, when they consider their own failures or consider things that they haven't done well, there's a desire to gloss over the struggle. There's a desire to gloss over the difficulties. And I've found, and I think that today's employees and consumers and customers value the willingness to be transparent about failures. Domino's turned around their business with that big campaign that was like, we know our sauce sucked before, but we've really spent a lot of time making it better. And that acknowledgement that it wasn't good, is very lackluster, made everybody trust them more. And then when you go and try and you say, actually, it really has gotten better, there's a lot there. I started this with a story about my business failure.
Mm.
Right? And I did that because I want people to know that I'm not just someone who sits here and tries to say that I know how it all works and it's always worked out for me every time. But that hopefully engenders a deeper amount of trust and helps you see my trajectory. And when I work with leaders and I work with founders, as whether clients or in other capacities, I really encourage them to find a way to talk about that story in a way that builds them up in the end. And there's always a way to do that, right? If you got what you wanted in the end, then there's a success story in that, well, we achieved the result. And if you didn't get what you wanted, you obviously learned something along the way. You made a shift, and that shift put you in a position to do what you want to do now. At the very least, they can understand your motivation for entering this new direction. And if you can't tell a story about your failure, then I don't think you've fully gotten over it. And I
Mm.
don't think you've fully learned everything you could from it. And I don't think you've utilized it as an asset for your future. That doesn't mean you have to go out and lead with that on every
Mhm.
conversation, but in the right time, in the right place, you should be able to talk about difficult, painful things that have happened to you and show people more of who you are so that you can build a deeper relationship and work more and collaborate better together.
Hmm. If you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
Oh, you're going to make me flip on myself. Oh, man. I would say that, um, I really think this question of, do you think that the environment is speeding up or slowing down? When you just ask yourself that question, you don't need to read a textbook. You don't need
Mhm.
to hear from an expert. You can make that assessment for yourself. And when you recognize what that assessment is, it really underscores the importance of being adaptable and being flexible and being more nimble than you probably are today as a leader, as a business. So I think that's still one of my most important takeaways.
Terrific. And if listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
We're going to put together a special link for listeners of this show at jasonshen.com/B2B Success. And that's going to have show notes for this episode, or it's going to have, you'll have the show notes, but we'll have some resources based on the things that we talked about, a place to download a first chapter of the Path to Pivot book, and opportunities to learn more about me. So sorry, don't mean to take all the important things away, but jasonshen.com/B2B Success. And then I'm on X, which I still can't stop saying Twitter, at Jason Shen, and YouTube, where I make longer form, thoughtful video content, Coach Jason.
Right. We'll include links to those in the show notes. Jason, this has been terrific. Just out of curiosity, do you have a date for when the book is coming out?
It's coming out the last week of October.
Okay. Brilliant. Hopefully the show will go out to run about then or just before. That should work well. Jason, this has been terrific. Lots of nuggets. Thank you for sharing.
Vinay, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure, and take care.